you ever been engaged in a relatively long conversation with someone when suddenly you've realized that the two of you aren't even participating in the same conversation? Shabbat Shalom, I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi, and let's stir up some Torah together. Obviously, this sort of realization is something that has become more and more pervasive as our dialogues, or our perceived dialogues, are happening online instead of one-to-one. But even one-to-one, the nature of our conversations have changed from dialogue much more into, well, you see this everywhere, vanquishing your opponent. Now, the word dialogue has die in it, which means two, which implies a sort of mutuality within two different people. And if my idea is I want to destroy the other person, and that's my conversation, I can promise you the person with whom I am speaking is not having the conversation I wish to be vanquished by this person. So it's actually not a dialogue, it's a monologue. And of course, if the other person has the same idea, which in 2022, as I'm recording this, is highly likely, they're also engaged in a monologue. And regardless of what we want to call it, a dialogue requires two people hearing each other. And if, as we are engaged in speaking back and forth with someone, we are not hearing what they're saying, but what we believe they're saying, we hear through our own ego, then if there is a dialogue involved, it's a dialogue with myself. The other person is simply providing a straw man for me to then tear down at my earliest convenience. Now, the reason I bring this up this week is there is a fascinating passage in Rabbi, our weekly Parashat, that involves charging interest. Now, it's especially important to bring up because, historically speaking, this passage and several that are related are central to, well, a fair amount of anti-Semitism. On the one hand, you've got law that's developed over time on do you charge someone within the tribe no interest and then someone outside the tribe with interest. And of course, within Judaism, that has led to people outside of Judaism making plenty of claims regarding anti-Semitism. But the other aspect of the passage is there is actually what seems to be a contradiction. And it's a bit of a subtle anti-Semitism. At the very least, it's an anti-religionism. When we look at the text of the Torah and we find contradictions, which they're all over, and assume an underlying stupidity, as opposed to looking why that might be there, other than the worst possible reasons that could possibly exist. And in reality, I think that what most of these contradictions boil down to, that are there on purpose, is there are two different conversations that are happening. So here's the text of the passage that I want to read to you. Now we're in chapter 15 of Deuteronomy, and the context is the Shemitah year. So every 7 years, the land gets to take a break, and then we remit our debts. And the two central texts are verses 6 and 7. Verse 6 reads, "For the eternal God will bless you as promised. You will extend loans to many nations, but require none yourself. You will dominate many nations, but they will not dominate you." Before I get to 7, this is a further explanation of a statement, a kind of shocking and maybe even a beautiful statement. Let's call it an ideal statement that is made. In verses 4 and 5, we read, "There shall be no needy among you, since the eternal your God will bless you in the land that the eternal your God is giving you as a hereditary portion, if only you heed the eternal your God and take care to keep all this instruction that I enjoin upon you this day." So we have this setup. This setup is, listen, you're not going to be extending loans within your own tribe, but other nations are going to come to you and you're going to go ahead and extend loans to them. And that's the basis of a lot of the anti-Semitic sort of things that are going on. And then you have the background or the reasoning for this. And that's that if you do everything that you're supposed to do, you're not going to have any needy among you. You're not going to need to give any loans. So now we have set up the situation where we're going to be dealing internal and external differently than each other, although the reason for the internal situation is based on an ideal. And then we get a contradiction to the ideal in verse. "If, however, there is a needy person among you, one of your kin in any of your settlements in the land that your eternal God is giving you, do not harden your heart and shut out your hand against your needy kin." Continuing to verse 8, "Rather, you must open your hand and lend whatever is sufficient to meet the end." And there we have it, our contradiction. Do not lend out, or you will not need to lend out among your own kinfolk, but yet if there's someone needy, go ahead and do that. Let's throw away Torah. It's completely stupid. It's filled with contradictions. It's written by primitive people at a primitive time, right? Or are we having two different conversations? And of course, that is the answer to the question. There are two conversations happening. We have an ideal conversation and a pragmatic conversation. And you're going to find these all throughout Torah. But in this specific one, it's fascinating. First of all, the anti-Semitic dialogue that's going on here. If you enter a study of any Jewish texts and you want to find things that you can use to slam the Jews, guess what? You're going to do it in the same way that if I look at any other religious texts. Heck, if I look at most philosophical texts, I can sit there and jump into the old maxim of most philosophers become philosophers in order to justify their own pathologies. If we want to tear someone down, we can. But if we read what's actually written here, this is a setup for an ideal. You should be able to build a state where there is no needy among you. That is the ideal. Now, that's the state that you're building. We understand that outside of our state, there might be people who aren't quite as morally elevated or ethically elevated, so they're going to be in trouble, and so go ahead and lend them stuff. You can take that as anti-Semitic as you want, or you can take it as a reflection of an ideal that's attempting to be built here. The ideal that we want to create such a situation that we will have no needy. That is our first conversation. That is a powerful conversation. But the second conversation is, guess what? We're not living in an ideal world. So even though it seems to contradict, it only contradicts if we don't understand the Torah is engaging constantly in two conversations, the ideal and the pragmatic. And at the pragmatic level, if you see someone needy, do not harden your heart. Why? And why is this not a contradiction? Because in the ideal world, this won't be necessary. We're not living in the ideal world. And quite frankly, we kind of never will be. The concept of an ideal is a parabola. We will keep on getting closer and closer if we try, if we work. The famous Franz Kafka quote, Mashiach will come one day after Mashiach is no longer needed. This says we don't get to wait for the world to fall apart and burn and destroy before it becomes better. We actually have the responsibility to, be responsible to right now with these hands and all the collective hands of everyone around the world to build and not tear down. Instead, work towards that ideal. But while we are doing that, we've got the pragmatic reality around us, and that means that we don't yet have a state where there are no needy. There are needy. So what do? Well, we might need to lend, even if that seems to contradict the statement that just happened before. It's only a contradiction if we decide to only have two conversations and not try to figure out a way to join them into a dialogue. And then if we take this seriously and bring it back to us today, having long conversations that have nothing to do with conversations and have nothing to do with dialogue and everything about vanquishing our rival. Well, I wonder how many of our horrible situations that we end up in where we cannot hear or be heard are similar sorts of things. If we're having a political conversation, I wonder if one of the two of us is talking about an ideal situation and the other of us is talking about the pragmatic reality. On the surface, we're going to seem to be contradicting each other. And think back to how many times we've engaged in some level of, it should be this way, and the other person says, but it's not that way, so we need to do this. Yes, but we should do this. And then once we realize we're not being heard, the first thing we do, instead of trying to understand that there are two separate conversations going on, we take what we are hearing through our ego, through our translation engine, not through our ears, and in order to vanquish our rival, we turn that into the very worst possible situation we can. In other words, we hear the worst possible intentions instead of attempting to assume not even the best possible intentions, but any good intentions whatsoever. It's called a straw man. And a straw man is the icon of our age. If we had a mascot for the world as it is right now, it is the straw man. There's a fascinating tool that I've encountered recently. Part of what are called Rappaport's rules of engagement, rules of conversation. So there are 4 different rules. I'm focusing on the first one, but they are developed by a games theorist, Anatole Rappaport, and a philosopher, Daniel Dennett. And the first of these rules, when we are engaged in a dialogue, is that we try to repeat, reflect, restate the argument of the person with whom we're speaking back to them in such a way that they respond, boy, I wish I would have phrased it that way, that's so good. Think about it for a second. What has just happened? Now, first of all, imagine that someone has done that to you. You feel you're not being heard, and then someone repeats back to you instead of what happens so often today, which is someone repeats, this is what I hear you saying, and it's cruel. It is the most dark version of what we've been trying to say. And yeah, not all of us are public speakers. Not all of us are going to be polished debaters. Not all of us are great conversationalists. Not all of us have really tried to formulate our thoughts as clearly as we would like to. But when the person that we're talking to comes back and repeats back to us the darkest, most possible, least generous version, how does that feel? And yet we do it to them as well. What would it feel like instead when someone really listened to us and heard what we said such that they could reformulate what we'd said even better than what we'd said? How would we feel about that person? And likewise, what's it going to do for the person with whom we're speaking if we're able to do that for them, not something to them? And if we're being completely honest, one of the reasons that we don't do that is we seem to have this idea that if we're able to understand an opponent's points, then somehow we're agreeing with them. Hearing someone doesn't mean agreeing with them. It means we've heard them. And if we ever wish for anyone to agree with us, well, they first need to feel heard by us. And it's perfect because we're about to step off into the High Holy Days. The month of Elul begins tomorrow. We are supposed to have a shofar that blows to say, wake up, wake up. You have hurt other people. You've destroyed relationships. It's time to make a full accounting of the people we've hurt. And we go and we begin actively repairing those relationships. And if we're being honest with ourselves, how many of our relationships that have, well, either been destroyed or been severely harmed have been because we've been engaged in two different conversations that just kept on getting worse, going more awry? Here's the thought. Here's a challenge for all of us for the month of Elul and then into the Yemim Noraim, the days of awe. How about when we're engaging these conversations, whether online or face-to-face, that when that moment happens where we know we are neither hearing nor being heard, both sides, one of us has the courage to say, you know what, I wonder if we aren't actually engaged in two different conversations right now. Let me try to reflect back to you what I think you're saying. Now, we don't get to have in this moment as expectations of what happens. Just because we've been able to do that in that moment does not mean the person with whom we're speaking is going to do that. It doesn't mean that they are going to reflect our words and do the same thing back, but they will have a radically different experience of what that conversation was than us just yelling at each other. And maybe I haven't repaired a relationship that has been hurt from two conversations the previous year, but this is at the very least going to prevent yet another relationship from needing to be repaired. I think the Torah constantly throws in these incredible contradictions to finally get us to the point where we realize the world is simply more complex than a single point of view that we might hold strongly. The Torah, our tradition, those who wrote and were inspired by that which is greater than them, were engaged in multiple goals. Some of those goals were understanding what everything should look like, and other of those goals were, let's deal with just how broken we are as human beings. I'm not sure we can ever reach the ideal if the only opinion we ever hear is our own. And if all of our dialogues are with people who believe exactly as we do, well, that's still a single monologue coming out of two mouths. We only get closer to that ideal by being challenged, by being a little bit less comfortable, by being a little less sure that we're right, and removing from ourselves this need to destroy or vanquish the person with whom we disagree. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. An early Chodesh Tov. Let's actually make this Shabbos and then this coming month of Elul truly meaningful. We'll see you next time.